This is The Extra Mile.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to The Extra Mile. I'm Justin Duncan, and I'm always here with my illustrious colleague, the G5. Hey, George, how are you?
I'm doing good. How you doing?
I'm doing great.
We have a guest with us.
That's right. We'd like to welcome to the podcast Dr. Sean Cunningham, my dear friend, who is the chair of the history department at Texas Tech University, and a fellow Christian and someone who I've been really happy to have on the podcast. So welcome to the talk.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
Welcome to Coffee Talk.
Coffee talk. I like the between two ferns actually. That's
right.
always been a dream of mine.
I was saying it because I do the video editing. I need to put these up on pedestals, so I have working on a design in my head, and also to replace this table to make it a little more, microphone arm friendly.
Yeah.
But coming up in the future.
But I like it. It's very Charlie Rose. I always liked that show before he lost his show.
Who is that guy? I can never remember his name from the 70s that always had interviews. He was really kind of soft spoken and.
Dick Cavett.
Dick Cavett, thank you. Yeah, so I've always wanted to do that kind of a show.
Yeah.
So
Dick Cavett, I believe, went from more of a late night, traditional Johnny Carson-esque talk show to something like that.
Like
he became more intellectual over time.
Same.
Bill Moyers had a thing like that as well. Moyers was actually a believer and a acolyte of Lyndon Johnson's for a long time.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I know that whenever you asked me to, George, for your information for the listeners, Sean asked me as a part of the Texas Tech History Department to have, what was that show that y'all did?
Well, it was something that I was a part of for a long time, and unfortunately, I think died because of COVID.
Oh, no.
But I believe the one that you participated in was the last one that we were able to put on before things shut down, early March of 2020. But it was called Civil Counterpoints, and I was part of a steering committee that put and it was actually not just the Department of History; it was the entire university that. Really believed in the idea that we need to talk to each other more, and that people from different viewpoints and ideologies and perspectives need to come together and have conversations rather than 180 character tweet fests and tweet fights. And so that one was actually on, I believe, the role of comedy and popular culture in political debates, and the idea of kind of touched on issues of political correctness, mentioned people like Dave Chappelle and Ricky Gervais, who say things that irritate everyone.
That's right.
But get at one point or another, we'll get everyone to laugh. And so we had you on there with two other comedians, and then a professor colleague of mine, Dr. Willett. Julie Willett, who studies the history of comedy. So,
See, that's cool. So it was a fun show, and that was Dick Cavett-esque.
Yeah, exactly.
It was kind of a debate, but nobody was really debating. Nobody had like a talking point.
No, it was supposed to be free form and kind of, I think, like this podcast is, and I think those are incredibly valuable. It doesn't always flow when you have people who have never met each other. But we did episodes of Civil Counterpoints on comedy, like I mentioned with you. But then we also did marijuana legalization. We did border security and immigration. We did climate change. We did free speech. All the and other topics over the course of about 2 or 3 years.
And nothing was ever like determined. It was just a space for people to chat and talk.
It was designed to be a space for people to talk. You put 4 or 5 people, on stage in front of an audience of 50 to 100 people, and then you're recording it, and they don't know each other. Sometimes it can be, it can discourage the flexibility of dialogue.
So
but
it
I
was
think
stagnant.
It was sometimes it was stagnant. It depended on the guests, honestly. People that were excellent at it, like you, kind of got things rolling.
Yeah. Comes in and always talks and never
Your
leaves
check's
any
in the mail,
silence.
Sean. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to it.
It's made of rubber.
I do work in education, so anything and everything helps.
No, I know that for at least for our conversation to have you on this podcast, that's really the point. Is that we want people talking about real things and having experts on. And then also talking about the Bible, because I'm fascinated with the Bible. I know George is as well. And I highly respect George for his knowledge of the Scriptures. He's actually a preacher here at this congregation, Milwaukee Avenue Church. And it's just one of those things where the more I and as you know, and our listeners know, I have done an extensive recording of the Bible, chapter by chapter, for the work here at this congregation, and that really has changed my life. And so it's about knowledge of the book and having it in your heart to be hungry for more knowledge.
Yeah, amen.
And so when it comes to history, first off, let's kind of establish your credentials, which obviously with your standing credentials, you have them. But what kind of brought you to teaching and to history, and what inspired you? Because you are from Lubbock.
I am from Lubbock, yeah. Born in Dallas, but raised in Lubbock. Went to high school here in Lubbock. Went to Texas Tech. Did two master's degrees at Texas Tech, and then and I can circle back to how I ended up in the historical profession, but. I fell in love with history, actually, and I tell students this. My dad has always been interested in history, and so and interested in politics. And when I was 11, so this was the fall of 1988, and I remember specifically the fall of 1988, two things happening that we were talking about in school and we were talking about at home were the presidential election of 1988, in which the two major candidates were George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis. And my parents had very strong opinions about that election, as most people have strong opinions about politics. And the other thing was that it was the 25th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, which was coming up November 22nd of 88, was the 25th anniversary, November 22nd, 63. And I remember learning about John F. Kennedy, learning about the Kennedy assassination, learning about the fact that it took place in Dallas. As any good Texan, I was raised to be a Dallas Cowboys fan, so I was familiar with Dallas. And I also knew that my parents watched a television show called Dallas, and that we visited Six Flags, which was theoretically in quote-unquote Dallas, even though at the time, I didn't know it was in Arlington. But, it's all one big Dallas, right? And so this event that felt like it took place in my backyard, and the conspiracy theories that were floating around in the 70s and 80s, and then were being broadcast on these specials in 1988 that my parents allowed me to watch, and I just was fascinated, and really became engrossed in reading about, even as a young kid, about the Kennedy assassination, and that of course evolved into interest in the 1960s and in American politics more broadly, and what happened with Vietnam. That was kind of my next step. And then, of course, you just start reading, and the interests kind of go from there. But interestingly enough, I didn't go to college to study history. I went to college to get a degree in, actually started as a journalism major.
Oh, wow.
A broadcast journalism major.
Yeah.
By the time I was 18, I really wanted to be an anchor on SportsCenter. And then my dad got me
That's weird.
got me an internship at a local television station my fall semester freshman year. Realized that I was going to work long hours, making about $18,000 a year for a long time before I was ever going to make it to Bristol, Connecticut. Changed my major to public relations on the advice of a just wonderful man and mentor from Texas Tech, Bill Dean. A lot of people know him as the president of the Alumni Association. And then fast forwarding to my senior year, went through, I would say, an existential spiritual crisis that landed me at the point of conversion. And I can go into that later, but really questioning what I was supposed to do in life and what I wanted to do after college, and sought counsel from college pastors here in town that I had been familiar with and knew, and other people that I respected, and eventually the question of the advice was trust the Lord, and what is it that you feel like you're good at, what is your passion? And I love teaching, I love talking about relevant things, and I love history. And ended up going to grad school for history, and the rest is history.
There we go. I love.
So now I study. So my research is in really Texas politics. I just published a book on Texas Democrats in the 1930s and the factional disputes within the Democratic Party in Texas in the 1930s surrounding the New Deal. My first book was actually on conservatives in the 60s and 70s. So I'm really interested in that, and this semester I'm teaching a class in Texas history, just basic introductory Texas history. I tend to do that at least once a year, and then I'm also teaching an overload for the Honors College at Tech on presidential politics from Kennedy to Reagan. So I get to kind of dive into that passion of mine, and that's been the best class I've had probably ever, actually.
You said you really enjoyed working that syllabus up.
I did, and you know what? I am a guy that is really committed to the syllabus in a class as a contract that I expect the students to follow.
I'm the same way.
And yet I also commit that what I tell them at the beginning of the semester is what I'm going to do. This is thankfully a smaller class of 23 just brilliant students. 21 or 23 really great students, actually. And just an amazing experience. But I have just blown up that syllabus almost on a daily basis just because of the way the conversations go. And you let the conversations, you don't want to stifle things. And so the students will raise questions in a small classroom setting that really parallel the kinds of conversations I like to have, like what you're having here.
That's so cool.
And I can't hear you, George. Let me see if I can turn the air off. You guys chat for a little bit.
Sounds good. No,
Did they call you Pastor G5, by the way?
No. Maybe Preacher G5 or something like
Preacher
that.
G5,
but,
I like it.
But no, I haven't got called that yet. So what's the best form of teaching, do you think?
That's a great question. Here's what I would tell. So as the chair of the department, one of my roles is to welcome and mentor new faculty. And we tend to hire, I guess, on average, maybe 1 to 2 new full-time tenure-track faculty per year. Over the course of years, that's how it will work out. And I get that question a lot from new faculty who want to succeed in the classroom, are coming from institutions that in some cases are very, very much like Texas Tech, a large state public university. But in some cases, we're hiring, the job market is so competitive. We're hiring from the very best schools in the country where their teaching experience may have been very limited and very different. And you'll get different opinions on this. I think a lot of my colleagues would say Socratic dialogue, conversation, facilitating discussion, round table, something like that. And I think that's great. That works very, very well, and I'm experiencing some of that in this class I just mentioned with my honors students this semester. I would also, though, tell my faculty to be who they are. And what I mean by that is that sometimes we have hired people who are extraordinarily gifted lecturers who can command an audience. And I imagine that as Christians, we've heard fantastic sermons. We've been around great preachers, and you could just sit and listen and be fed by that sort of teaching.
Yeah.
And I would tell someone who is good at that to embrace that and to not be afraid of an old-fashioned lecture where you get up and you just talk. And in fact, when I have in my Texas history class this semester, I have 440 registered students. It's actually down to 417 right now. And then next semester I'll have 270 to begin the semester. That is an almost impossible situation to have a quote-unquote roundtable discussion.
Oh, yeah.
And so I have figured out how to hold attention in a room that size, and I don't shy away from that. And I would tell someone who's good at that not to shy away from it. But at the same time, when I go into a room of 20 students, I think that affords an opportunity to do more discussion and conversation and kind of sit back and propose something and then allow the students to go back and forth. And I tell you, that's the thing that has made that honors class that I mentioned now a couple times this semester the best class I think I've ever taught. Has nothing to do with me. It has to do with from day one setting the stage for, okay, we're going to talk about politics this semester, and we're going to talk about things that I think they find extraordinarily relevant. Shockingly enough, there is nothing new under the sun, and so things that Americans were debating and arguing about in the 60s are some of the same things we're debating about now. And I have students on the far left, I have students on the far right, and that means different things. Far left economically is not always the same thing as far less socially, and same on the
Sure.
right, and what makes up the middle and the independent. And yet everyone has just respected one another and shared their opinion freely and honestly, but again, respectfully. And we've had just great back and forth. And that's the kind of stuff that I think has benefited them.
Now, kind of backed up, do you think that's like a common trend or a future trend in this next generation to have civil dialogue, or is that just a byproduct of being in the same room?
You know, Justin and I have been getting together every once in a while and having coffee, and just talking about life and talking about politics and talking about our faith for several years. And I do that with other friends. And but I think the point of civil counterpoints, which we were talking about earlier, is this filling this void where that sort of thing does not happen as much as it should. I do think I have this working hypothesis that social media is the worst thing that's ever happened in the history of the world, and I know that's not true, because there are a lot of valuable, wonderful things that can come from new forms of technology.
So much
new
good,
forms
so
of
much
media.
bad.
But I do think that we have trained ourselves to form opinions quickly, and then to express those opinions in 180 characters or less, or whatever it is on these platforms, or to just kind of tribalize ourselves into corners, or to identify ourselves. We all want to belong, right? I mean, that's human nature. We want to belong. We want to be a part of something. And I think especially in a world where there's spiritual wandering, and I believe that the American church has kind of dropped the ball in a number of areas in terms of its perceived, at least, relevance to the world in which we live. And people gravitate to wherever they can go most easily and find some sort of tribe, whether it's online or in a social media platform or in some sort of other group. And I think that groupthink and putting ourselves into these silos, it leads to polarization. So no, I don't think that's a trend. I that's one of the things that has made this class such a wonderful experience, is that I think it bucks the trend, and it gives me a lot of hope that this future generation is actually capable of having these sorts of conversations in the right setting, because there have been times when I go onto Facebook, or I'll go onto Twitter, or I'll go onto, those are the two that I basically use, but I know other people are on Instagram or on whatever. There's a million other things, right? And these sorts of long form podcasts, those help, and I know those are popular, and I can think of several that do this sort of thing that have become popular. So I think there is a thirst for this kind of conversation. I don't know if it's a trend.
That makes sense. Now, in your class, is there like a lot of tension at times where people are passionate about what they believe and they just want to get that out of there? Or
you know what? I think it is.
How do you keep it civil?
There's a lot of laughter.
That's good. So
I
comedy,
think it's key.
like
I think comedy is a hugely important part of dialogue. I think not taking yourself too seriously. I shared a series of clips in class not that long ago from The Simpsons. The Simpsons is a love it or hate it, but The Simpsons has always been pretty witty when it comes to politics,
Sure.
and it can skewer anyone. And I think Saturday Night Live I don't watch Saturday Night Live. I haven't watched Saturday Night Live in years, but actually loves the politics that Saturday Night Live put on the air I didn't love the politics, but I loved the political satire.
Sure.
From the mid 70s through the early 90s, and that's kind of when I kind of lost track. 2000, they did a great job in the election of 2000. Probably cost Al Gore the election actually in 2000.
Oh, interesting.
But comedy is really important, and so I think in that classroom it's humor. I think that we have learned somehow. And I like to think maybe I've set the table, because I will make fun of all sides. Yesterday it was Jimmy Carter. But a little bit of Ronald Reagan. I kind of mocked both of them, and on Thursday we'll kind of pick apart both George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis. So, yeah.
Well, the ability to laugh or to make someone laugh, I think, builds a sort of trust.
Yeah.
And that breaks the walls, the barriers down.
It's relatable. It relaxes
Yeah.
you. It so you think about the tension.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to be both tense and laughing. Probably. I don't know. It seems like that would be difficult.
As an actor, some of the most tense experiences I've had on stage in storytelling, Like, for instance, there's a Sondheim musical called Into the Woods, and a character that I played once was Cinderella's prince. And in the second act, there's a line where he's had an affair with another character in the play, the baker's wife. And Cinderella, I mean, it's Cinderella's prince, it's Prince Charming. She confronts him in like a down in one, which is like just two actors, and they have a dialogue. Mm-hmm. And she confronts him, her husband, Prince Charming, about his affair with this other person. And his line is, "I was raised to be charming, not sincere."
Yeah. Yeah.
And it always gets a laugh.
Yeah.
And
even though it's a very serious moment.
Right.
It's an extremely serious moment.
Right.
And it's basically this husband being like, "Hey, I don't care about you.
Yeah.
I care about me." And I'm telling you, whenever I deliver that line, I try to every way under the sun to try to get it to land as a serious moment. It tore the house apart with laughter. And I was fretting about this to my director at the time, and I said, "I don't understand how such a serious line gets that big of a laugh."
Right.
And then it was that first impetus of understanding in a story how audiences will react to extremely serious stimuli. So, for instance, you have this person being basically saying, "I don't care about you.
Yeah.
I care about me and my awesomeness, and I'm awesome." And it gets this wave of laughter. It's because the audience can't really handle that as a serious moment, and that a lot of people find it so ludicrous, they find relief in the laughter.
Well, it's a defense mechanism, right?
Yes.
Comedy, laughing is a defense mechanism.
Yes.
It also does have, though, I think, in where you're going with that, and I could see this criticism of comedy in mocking, belittling, underplaying the importance of some of the conversations that we're having, or in some way reducing the severity of certain issues to something that someone might not find as important. And I could see that criticism, and I would say maybe there's a criticism in America that we don't take issues, that we're flippant or glib when we handle certain issues, that we don't really take them seriously. Certainly think that there are critics of American culture on the, I would say, as a very sloppy term, the evangelical right, who would look at American culture today and call it sloppy and glib and careless and inattentive to the seriousness of whether it's sin specifically or the seriousness of just moral failings. And I think that's a fair point. I don't know that I would say that it means that comedy doesn't serve purpose, but I do think that your point there is that there's something in that moment, in the context of that particular musical as well, is that there's other funny lines. So people have been conditioned to laugh for a couple hours to that point. Whereas if you were in a more serious production, they would maybe find it awkward to laugh at that.
Yes. Well, you're exactly right.
Yeah, oh, I'm just saying. Well, comedy can be used to build up or to abuse, just like anything else that we do. It really comes down to the heart of the person.
Well, and Sean said it right, which is, I agree, which is the context of the comedy. Whereas, yes, in that particular instance for that musical, they're conditioned to laugh. They've done it the whole show. It's just a light, happy-hearted. It's all about fairy tale characters. And then it all hits the fan, and things go awry very quickly, and they all turn on each other, and none of them are sinless in this production. Right. And boy, doesn't that... I mean, that would be an interesting Bible study, actually, is going through the stories of Jesus and finding the comedy.
One of my favorite sermons literally is, I was listening to this, and he went through each one of where Jesus kind of uses humor to relate to people, to bring his message out, and just be, well, human like he was in a sense as well. And it was so interesting because we can read this and we can feel kind of dull just reading it, and we just are blandly reading it. But to read it in that sense or in that context, as you were pointing out, really opens up.
Well, and I think it's one of the reasons why the television series The Chosen has been so popular among American viewers, world viewers, Christians, is in part because the actor who portrays Jesus in that series has a very quick wit. And he, for the most part, I believe, sticks to consistent biblical reading. I know there are debates about that, but he's funny in that show. He's funny and he's relatable. And I know that the producers of that show actually got into quite a bit of hot water maybe last year or 2 years ago when they put out a promo that was a promo for the film that depicted Satan teaching a class of student demons. And the day's lesson was about how the Chosen television show was reaching too many people, because Jesus was presented as relatable, and a lot of people who didn't quite catch on to that humor did not appreciate the use of humor in depicting Satan as, in that case, kind of a bumbling teacher,
right?
And all those demons as kind of incompetent. And in fact, in that trailer, some of the demons are actually converted to Christianity because of the show, and it's a very funny, but it's relatable, but it also isn't very weighty. And I suppose there's always a need to take Scripture seriously. I mean, it is the holy, inerrant Word of God. Right. And so, I guess there's a balance there between making it relatable and the reverence for it. But
there is a balance, because there does need to be a reverence and a seriousness, because it is your soul.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it is a message of love, and it needs to connect with people too. That is tricky. I guess it goes back to what you were saying too. Context is important.
I think the point there is just the conversation about it. I mean, if you try to strike a balance and try to make it relatable, and don't compromise the truth of what's there, but make sure that people are exposed to it in some way. And I think that getting people exposed to Scripture, or just exposing people to conversations about Scripture, is very difficult these days. People's attention span is often limited.
Well, kind of tapping into that too. I mean, The Chosen does a unique thing where it is relatable, and it does stand out from other Christian, quote unquote, just media that just seems to fall flat all the time.
Yeah.
And why do you think that is? How do we have those conversations, you think?
Why does Christian media fall flat?
Yeah, why it just kind of falls flat. Yeah, why it's honestly not good. Yeah.
It's not like this. It's not real. It's often very scripted, stale, and cheaply produced. Yeah. I think a lot of films that have been done, and there are maybe some exceptions out there, but whether it's The Chosen or something going back to, I think it was 2004, The Passion of the Christ, which had a I don't remember what the budget was, but it was a Mel Gibson production. It was an enormous budget. Things that are done in between that, or you go to, and I won't say any by name, but there are cable channels that have existed for a long time that are very, and this is an outdated reference, but very Wayne's World, where they look like they're produced in someone's mother's basement, and there's just not a lot of input. So I don't know. It's a very, very good question. I will say that I think this generation expects, one of the things that we do in this class that I teach on campaign politics in the 60s and 70s and 80s is kind of track the evolution of political advertising and how it evolved from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s, and the artistry gets better, the cinematography gets better, the writing gets better, and there is almost an expectation, I think, that you can stream almost anything now. You can, basically, and you have the democratization of media in that anybody can put together a podcast that someone could watch. Yes. And so talent is available out there. And so I think that it has raised the expectation and the standard. And too many Christians have not engaged in that form of media making.
It is interesting because this very podcast, if you're watching this on YouTube, you could literally click on Conan O'Brien's podcast.
Right.
And so it's the great equalizer. And I think it has to do with the cost of the equipment. For instance, Very recently, we invested in some additional cameras for the headshots. They're all 4K cameras.
Yeah.
They're not the most, I mean, they're probably the cheapest that we could buy.
Yeah, they are.
And that's okay.
But they're high quality.
I mean, let's not get too brazen with
The
our
mics
comments.
are good. The mics are good.
Yeah, the mics are great. These microphones are great. But the idea is that, it's like when Polaroid cameras came out.
Right.
Where I was shocked. I was walking through the stacks at the library at Texas Tech when I was a student there. And on I guess I can't remember now. It's S3, I think. The stacks 3 where the music stuff is. And over here it's just like scores and scores and scores of music. And over here was sort of like art and theater and photography. And so I was sort of meandering through, and I picked out a book, and I did so much learning, just like opening the book and saying, wow, that's a crystal clear photo. Well, who are these people? This was taken in 1961.
Right.
That shot is so high definition, crystal clear. And then you look at sort of from whenever we were younger, all of our Polaroids and our early digital camera shots.
It makes an enormous
so grainy.
difference. It makes it, and
exactly.
It makes an enormous difference. I found a photo that was a high resolution, high def photo of a, I forget if it was, it wasn't Bell, maybe it was General Dynamics. I forget which. It was basically a World War II industrial plant that was assisting with the war effort in Fort Worth, 1942, 43, 44. And there was a story that was done by some reporter that year that was looking at the Rosie the Riveter. And you've seen the poster of We Can Do It, and it's the woman that went to work while her husband or father or brother went off to fight the war.
We can actually put it up on the film.
There you go. So now you're seeing it right now.
Yeah.
But this was a high-def shot, somehow. A high-resolution, high-def shot of a 20-year-old woman who was riveting into an aircraft to get it ready to fight, the Nazis and the Japanese in World War II. And it is so relatable. Just that image. I can talk about how students just like you, were making decisions about your future. You weren't going to be able to go to college. You were not going to be able to get married at a certain age. You were going to have to experience this sort of a sacrifice. And here's a 20-year-old woman who looks just like you, and here's what she's doing. And somehow that image is relatable. It doesn't look grainy. It doesn't look like it's from another planet or another world, or it's old people did that, other generations did that. It's like that could happen to me as well. I think Christians, or anyone who wants to make a message, whether you're a political candidate or you are just trying to reach people for the Lord, it's one of those tough decisions I suppose you have to make with a limited budget. Is, do you want to be relatable? Do you want to be in the world but not of the world? And if you're going to do that, you have to produce high quality things. And I think God calls us to excel at our vocations and anything that we do, and do it for the Lord. And so if you're going to do a podcast, do it right.
I agree. Well, I mean, or anything. I mean, and it goes to the same, like I've been teaching classes with George at the congregation here. And even the last however many lectures or however many classes we've done, I feel like we've just absolutely increased in quality. And it's been so beneficial for me. And maybe that's just because I have a frontal lobe now and or what have you. But just getting the nose in the book and being able to pull all kinds of different parallels, it starts really syncing together in this beautiful synergy of, I start seeing this parallel here and there and everywhere, and it really becomes more relatable. And that's how I've been approaching the classes, which I know we stream on YouTube. If you're interested in ever watching those, you can see those. For anybody who's listening who might be interested in seeing those classes, is that we do film them. But the idea that we brought in the third quarter class was we want to show pictures of where these events took place. We don't know. It was 2,000 years ago, but we don't know for certain. But the Sea of Galilee's there.
Right.
And you can at least say, well, somewhere on this shoreline, this happened.
Planet Earth.
Yeah.
You could fly there and see it. And people do.
And how from Lubbock, or, from our topography here, it's so different. It's vastly different. And so it makes it more relatable. It makes it feel real. Right. And that was so enlightening for me to say, the Sea of Galilee is about the size of the Lubbock Loop.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even though to me it's a sea and it's this vast body of water, but really it's just like a lake.
Right.
And so that being said, that it was so eye-opening, as that was the domino falling of how do I make these characters real? So this quarter we're talking about Moses and the Exodus, and how Moses to me was always this beacon of, oh, well, this is like the untouchable man of God, right? He spoke with God, he saw God, he was in the presence of God, and he was trained and buried by God.
Right.
And he brought the people out of Egypt. He was the great servant. And to me, that was always just sort of like, well, he's the untouchable. Christ is the untouchable. And they were men. And that's something to really keep in mind, is they were just like you and me. They had the same desires and the same thoughts and the same wants and hopes. And God called them.
Right.
Now, Christ was sent here for a different purpose than Moses, perhaps, but Moses fulfilling his obedience to God, it brought about his ability to bring an entire nation with him,
right,
and into the new law. And for us, I think we still have that same power today. You know, with teaching, with being a preacher and a teacher, these responsibilities are on our shoulders to make it real and to make it high quality and to understand as deeply as we can to the extent of our knowledge and what God will allow us to understand, to be able to say we can obtain these things as well, and being servants of God.
Yeah.
And not servants of ourselves. Is
Well,
that
I
too
mean,
much?
No, that was good.
Okay,
No, that makes sense, and it immediately makes me think of, and I don't remember the chapter. I want to say Hebrews 11, but I don't know if that's accurate or not.
You can pull it up.
Got it.
But it's the basically the Hebrews Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
And
Roll
it's
call of the faithful.
You know, the call of and so you think about and go through, and I've been through studies where they look, you know, lesson to lesson at each of the individuals that is mentioned there, of people who have done and did extraordinary things that God called. And these were not superheroes. This was not you know, the Hall of Justice. These were normal, ordinary humans. And I think making that it's all about relevance.
Yeah.
And it's relatable and you know, not you assume that Moses is superhuman in being able to do all of these things, and that no one, but he was a sinner, he was a murderer, he did all sorts of things that would disqualify him theoretically for public office, and you know, in the 21st century. But he's a normal person, and making those things relatable. I think that the Bible is extraordinarily relevant to the world that we live in.
I like, so I pulled up Hebrews 11 too, and like you're saying, it goes through each one of those people, you know, Moses and Gideon and some of the judges, and these people who did amazing things, and yet still are very human. I love what the Bible does, where it actually portrays one of their characters, if you will, as a human, like flaws and perfection as well. But in verse 39 through 40, it says, "And these all were commended," talking about those heroes of faith, "for their faith, yet they did not receive what was promised, for God had provided something better for us, so that they would be made perfect together with us." And I love that idea that faith is so important because it is relatable and it's something that can connect with others. Yeah. That's very unique. I don't think I've seen it like that before.
Well, I think that what Scripture teaches is that that we are all made in the image of God.
Yes.
Yeah.
Designed to worship God. It's the ultimate point, I believe, of our existence on this earth, is to reflect back God's glory.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so there is something innately human about wanting to worship something bigger than yourself, wanting to belong, wanting to be a part of something, wanting to identify. And I think if you look at the splintering of modern American culture, and not just global, but just American culture, over the last, you know, several decades, going back into the early 20th century, all of it can in some way be examined through the lens of how people find meaning and purpose and value in everything but Christ. And how there is, but all of it is a reflection of that innate longing to identify with or belong to or worship something, whether it's politics, sex, alcohol, drugs, entertainment, whatever it is.
So no, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. That goes a lot with the whole nihilism type idea that your truth is your truth. How do you, in your classroom, do you see that as something that common amongst this younger generation? Is them finding meaning? Is that a big thing? And
I don't know that I see it. I don't see it articulated that often. I don't think the all of the fretting about the adoption of either a nihilistic or a postmodern relativistic worldview is something that I see happening en masse on the college campus purposefully. I do think that you see that kind of expressed from time to time, but but students are very smart and they're open to ideas. I think one of the best things about living in a postmodern age, and there are many bad things, but one of the best things about living in a postmodern age is that students are often very open to new ideas, and they're very open to being challenged. And if you can get them into a setting like this or like the classroom that I've talked about, where it's a comfortable place to express thoughts and ideas, that they will be open to the idea that maybe there is such a thing as an identifiable objective truth, and certainly. The perception that all students of this particular generation have adopted a relativistic view I would say, is not accurate at all. I'd say that there's actually kind of a counterculture to that culture in which objective reality and objective truth is highly valued. But I think that the thing that I see most often is an intolerance for someone else's opinion. And I think you can worship tolerance in a problematic way, where you refuse to take a stand and hold to a conviction. But I think in most cases, what I see are students who are respecting differences of opinion while not necessarily wavering on their own. Does that answer you? I don't know where that goes.
No, it makes sense.
I know from my own experience in graduate school, I always found myself to be very silent in class because I was very interested in listening.
Right.
And once again, it was probably because I was in my early 20s. Whereas if I were to go back to school, graduate school now, I would have a lot more to say because I've lived longer. And my mentor, Ricky Duhame, he always had a saying, which was, there's really no substitute for just simply being on the earth longer than other people. And so there's wisdom in age, but then once again, I found myself in school as a 21, 22, 25-year-old person saying nothing in class and listening and not necessarily being able to articulate my thoughts and opinions in a discussion, even because my graduate school classes were sometimes sub 8 people.
Right.
So we were having maybe 4 3-people discussions. And then you'd have like the larger classes that, had 18 to 20 people. That was grad school. My undergrad was very similar. And so when you say 400 people in your class, that's shocking to me because at Austin College, my undergrad, we were maybe 13 to a class. And so I had that intimate experience in class my whole college career. But once again, still very silent.
Right.
I have nothing to – you're the professor.
Yeah.
And I know nothing about music history.
Right.
So lecture and let me take notes.
Well, and one of the big problems with the experience that students are having in college is that in many cases, and I'm an enormous fan of public education. I support public education. My kids are in public schools. I respect other choices as well on that. But I work with an organization out of Austin called Humanities Texas that is the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and its chief mission, it does a lot of different things, but one of its chief goals is to provide continuing education for public school teachers in the state of Texas. And I've participated in these workshops and actually hosted one in Lubbock last summer that dealt with Texas history, kind of just equipping teachers to go back into the classroom with new ideas. And one of the very frustrating things that I see trickle into a problem related to what we're discussing is that the state legislature has so involved itself in very specific ways as to what children should be taught or should not be taught in the classroom, that teachers, whenever I work at these institutes to try to provide the continuing education, you look back at what's called the Texas Educational and Curricular Standards or something like that, the TEKS, and you have to kind of check a lot of boxes to make sure you're doing this and not doing this. And what I think that does is it stifles creativity, it stifles ongoing conversation, it stifles the ability of someone to chase a tangent and answer a question that might be relevant to a student in that moment. And quite frankly, it kind of manifests in ways that are boring, and it dulls, in history at least, you get students as freshmen or as sophomores taking an introductory class, and I'll talk to them on the very first day of class. How many of you enjoy history? And almost nobody raises their hand. Right. And how many of you, how many of you had, learned this in high school history classes? Well, no, that wasn't on the list. And part of that is because there's accountability and it's tax dollars, but we've politicized all of these things so much as to stifle creative exploration of new ideas. And so students arrive at college not so much trained to be nihilistic postmodern relativists, but they are trained to think that it's not relevant to their lives at all, that what they're about to hear is dull, boring, irrelevant, hoops to jump through on the way towards some sort of career, rather than embracing education as an opportunity to expand your mind and kind of and grow in the experience that you talked about, life on earth, being here, time. Part of that is education and kind of thinking about new things. But I don't think many of our students are arriving on college campuses well prepared to do that.
I think that it's exactly parallel with the religious side of life. Going to church and having grown up in the church, it was just something that took me away from video games,
right,
or took me away from doing the things that I wanted to do. And
we always skipped church as a kid if the Cowboys played at noon.
Interesting.
And so if the Cowboys played a noon game, it was like, well, we're going to stay home and just make sure we don't miss kickoff.
Yeah.
See, I think that's so interesting to say about what is relative, and saying that we as creatures on this earth are designed to worship. I guess you'd be worshiping the whistle at the beginning of the game.
Basically. Yeah.
Well, how do you make something like faith important to people? You were talking earlier about, them finding meaning in things like sex and, maybe like sports or something like that. How do you make faith essentially mean more than that?
The first thing that I think of is in the U.S. survey that I teach, usually in the spring, which is American history since 1877. I show a video. It's usually kind of an extra credit assignment that I can assign, and it's a video that's produced several years ago by PBS on the so-called hippie counterculture of the 1960s, and specifically about this moment in time in San Francisco in the summer of 1967 that became known as the Summer of Love. And it's about an hour-long documentary that talks about college students kind of pilgrimaging. I don't think that's a word, but going to San Francisco. We'll make it a word. Relative.
Sounds good. It's new now.
It's my truth.
I understand exactly.
They go to San Francisco, to the Haight-Ashbury district, and they experiment with LSD, and they experiment with marijuana, and they drink, and they have free love, and they do all of these things. And when immediately, and the Grateful Dead, and the birth of and Jimi Hendrix is in the background somewhere, and you've got all of this kind of stuff. It's the quintessential tie-dye 60s. And so you can grab their interest immediately because sex, drugs, and rock and roll is very interesting. But one of the things that we do when we have the discussion that follows that film is kind of unpack the testimonials of the people that are now in the 21st century looking back on their experience at the Haight-Ashbury. And every single one of them, it's not a Christian film, and it's not talking, it doesn't mention Christian faith in any way, but it talks about meaning and purpose. I was a kid growing up in blue collar Boston, and my parents fought all the time, and we were poor, and my brother went off to fight in Vietnam, and I just didn't know why that mattered and why we were there, and nobody would explain it to me, and I got depressed, and these people invited me to get on a bus and go to San Francisco, and so I ran away from home, and I got there, and it was great. And then later, the story is, after I got there, I realized that it was empty. It was hollow. That I was looking for meaning. I was looking for purpose. Every single one of these stories. And there are people that came from, very white collar, suburban, affluent families where there were no problems in the home, but it seemed plastic and stale. And they realized, you know what, all my parents could talk about was whether they were going to buy a new car or whether they needed a third television or things like that. And I just felt like there was more to life.
Yeah.
And so each one of these people arrived at the Haight-Ashbury in the summer of 1967 to experiment with LSD and drugs and sex, because they recognized that there was a hole in their life. And so I turned that conversation into this idea about what is it that provides you meaning and value. And so I think that is kind of an approachable gateway to a conversation about meaning and value. I can't tell you, as an administrator, I teach classes, but most of my day is spent on the tech campus administering, aspects of my department. And one of the overarching themes of the past, especially 3 years, has been mental health. There is a shortage of counseling. There is, you can't get an appointment in the student counseling center. It's a two or 3 month wait. The psychology department has a clinic, but they're booked. The human sciences has counselors, but they're booked. Counselors in private practice are, booking. My wife is a counselor in private practice, and she's booking into May already.
Whoa.
And so students then, what happens then is students will come to me, and have been doing this even this week, is, I'm struggling. I couldn't get out of bed for 2 weeks. One student came to me recently and kind of pulled up his arm sleeves and showed me he'd been cutting himself. And these are all opportunities for, when you do that, what are you doing? You're saying, okay, my brain is going to explode because I've got so much anxiety and so much fear and so much depression that maybe if I cut myself, it will be a distraction, and get it out. I got to get it out somehow. And so those kinds of conversations on the college campus are happening everywhere. And so how do you make faith relevant? I always will ask, is like, well, who's your support system? I don't have anyone. Well, tell me about, back home. It's like, well, I don't get along with my mom. My dad's not around, and everyone's got their life. Everyone's got their junk. And so, but they're all looking for something. Just like in 1967, they were looking for something in the Haight-Ashbury. In 2022 in Lubbock, Texas,
They're looking for the same thing.
They're looking for the same thing.
Yeah.
It's not manifesting with a San Francisco Summer of Love. Exactly, but it kind of is, whether it's pandemic hookup culture, or drugs. I think marijuana use is at an all-time high in the United States, and you could debate whether that should be legal or not, but certainly people are using anything and everything to escape, and I think that's where Jesus is. That's where Jesus is escape to me.
Sean, I think that was such a great thing to say, and I think that there's so many people out there that can reflect exactly what you talked about. You're trying to look for something in your life that you're missing. And as three people who have put on Christ, I would say that we found that hole being filled in our hearts with Christ. and with service and the things that Christianity asks us to do, which is to be selfless and to seek others. When Jesus was asked by the Pharisees, what is the greatest commandment, teacher? And they were sort of being snarky, I would assume, if I were going to do that line reading.
Right.
His response was simply, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul. And the second commandment, which was unprovoked, is like it, which is love your neighbor as yourself. And on these two things pivot the entire law and the prophets.
Amen.
And so for me in my life, which is trying to fill that hole just like everybody else is, and I think if you feel the same way, that's our testimony, is we are trying to find that hole being filled with love, which is God. 1 Corinthians 13 tells us that God is love, and that love is patient, love is kind. It suffers long, whereas self does not. And those type of testimonials, if you're hurting and you're needing counseling or whatever, the pages of the Bible are there. And I would recommend starting in Ephesians or anywhere in the New Testament. Pick a small book if you want, or even, we have recordings, or just seek the answers there perhaps as an option. And open your heart up to God and the healing that he can provide.
I would add to that real quick, just as a recommendation. My favorite book of the entire Bible is Ecclesiastes.
Yeah, mine too.
Really?
That's so
good. And it's so relevant.
I disagree with you. I think y'all are both wrong. I'm kidding.
It is often seen as depressing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it speaks to exactly what we've been talking about, which is that everyone goes through, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, and even if you are a walking disciple, which we three are. I struggle with this every day. There are times when I will still seek out comfort and peace and find a distraction in TV or in something else, right? And you just kind of want to get away. Far too often, I don't pour myself into God's word. I don't pray. And I know every time I do, it is life fulfilling, but that's the ultimate lie, is that it's not going to be fulfilling when the reality is we know that it is. But
isn't that so true?
Ecclesiastes speaks to all of these things and then wraps it up with, here's the end of the matter. Worship God.
Exactly.
Fear God,
Fear
and
God,
keep his
and
commandments.
keep his commandments.
So like verse 14 of Ecclesiastes 12. For God will evaluate. Well, here, let me back up to verse 13. It makes more sense. Having heard everything, right, I have reached this conclusion: fear God and keep his commandments, because this is the whole duty of man. So he's heard everything. He's searched for meaning in all places. Like you're saying, that's a good message for those that are trying to find meaning and inflicting themselves pain. For God will evaluate every deed, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. And I love Matthew 5, where Jesus kind of parallels this in a sense, and he talks about the salt and the light. And he says in Matthew 5 verse 13, "You are the salt of the earth." Right? As people are looking for something. This is Jesus. For if the salt loses its flavor, how can it be made salty again? For it's no longer good for anything except to be thrown and trampled on by people. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. People do not light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, where it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before people, so they may see your good deeds and give honor to your Father in heaven. And that's just, if you're looking for something, God says, look, not only is Jesus and his people, which make up his body, should be a light on a hill, should be a beacon of truth to run to find meaning, where now we can shine light on all those who are in the house. And so it's like, enter this house, right?
Well said.
Yeah.
Well, and Sean, you said that we are a reflection of the light, which is God. And that's exactly what that's talking about, yep. Where you have to make a change in your life. And, if you're living in that level of self-loathing and hate, or even emptiness, it will require a change. I'm sure what your point about your documentary, your PBS documentary, is that the people reflecting on their life decades prior, they're not the same people that they were in the summer of Ashbury.
Right.
So there is a change implied in the life as well. We need to wrap it up, unfortunately. Matthew 5:41, later in that same chapter, it talks about Jesus saying a Roman soldier at the time could I guess, conscript you to carry a load, a burden for them for the length of a mile. It was their Roman right. And Christ, in a bit of radicalness and teaching, he says, if someone implores you to go with them a mile, go with them another. Yeah. Go with them the extra mile, which is the name of the podcast. How would you counsel any listeners, any students, any people who are contemplating a life with Christ? How would you counsel them to go the extra mile in your own life and what that means to you?
It's a great question. I think that one of the things that our world is often very deficient of these days is empathy. Empathy, patience, endurance, a willingness to walk the extra mile in someone else's shoes, to use a different cliche. I think we only have one life. It is the gift of God that we are appointed to be here for a certain amount of time, and our days are numbered. And so, I know that from the perspective of a believer, when I am with other people who are hurting, trying to just give radically of yourself, give radically of your time, to not be bound by a schedule as regimented as most of our lives are, and mine is. I've got 30-minute blocks on my calendar all day, every day. But being interruptible and choosing relationship whenever possible, and valuing that. I think we are too self-indulgent often, including me, into quick fixes, and I think pursuing the slow fix is perhaps one way to do that. But it is about radical change, and it is about doing things outside of your comfort zone, and giving of yourself, both time and emotion, even when you don't feel like it. And so that's maybe the thoughts that come to mind right now. But it's a great question. I think it's a question that it's a great title for the podcast, and it's something that everybody can be thinking of every day, is what does the extra mile mean to me today? What does it mean for me to be a Christ follower today? Or if you're not, and you're wandering, and there's something out there, but you're not sure what it is, don't give up on that question. Don't settle for the cheap, quick fix.
That's awesome. Thank you, Sean, for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure.
And I will speak without George, but I'd like to have you back sometime soon, and we can continue our chats about history.
I do too.
And about Christ and his love, and about healing and all those other things. So thanks for your time. I really appreciate being here.
Absolutely. It's an honor to be here. Thank you both.
All right. Like that. Go so.